Hello and welcome to Writing Critiques, where you can submit your writing for honest feedback. In today's episode, we've got the first submission from someone who's not myself. In this case, it's a friend who's showing us her intro to a superhero novella. I think it's an excellent piece of work, and let's cut to the potato cam so we can see how she went. Okay, so before we get started, I just wanted to say that if you want to submit your writing to be critiqued, just email yourwritingcritiques@gmail.com. I definitely welcome people submitting videos, for example, or recordings of them reading their own work, so you can skip my terrible reading. But with that, let's move on to this week's submission. So as some background, I'm actually not sure, even though she's a friend, whether the submitter of this work wanted me to say her name, and I'll be keeping her anonymous just in case. She sent an email to accompany this work, which outlined some of her backgrounds and her aim for this topic, but I will keep that to myself for now because let's let the work speak for itself. So with all that preamble out of the way, it's about time we get to that reading. Oh, and apologies, bad voices, and accents ahead, fair warning. Issue 1. Sign the contract. Errol Mason stood stark naked in front of about 20 people. His cheap suit, seams torn, partially melted and unraveled like tissue paper around one of the exposed building support struts. Standing nude in rubble and debris, he recalled a similar nightmare as a teen. An hour ago, Errol worried that he would look shabby for this job interview. His breath smelled like chicken cup noodles, only diet for weeks now. He needed a haircut and his shaver had broken halfway down his left cheek, leaving him with a 3-week shadow on one side. No water in the apartment, clothing smelling of sweat and mold. Going commando had seemed like a good idea to reduce the smell. He needed this job. He was stealing spoons and sugar packets from fast food stores, broke. 3 months behind on rent, broke. Did you see that? Someone took a photo of Errol, like they'd never seen a naked black man before. He grabbed the end of his pants. It was dusky with soot and partially melted. He didn't have enough fabric here to cover himself. The scrap fell to pieces in his hands while he pulled out his thin wallet and phone. Wallet singed, old shitty phone still working. The foyer of Stardust Global was a mess. A lady bravely rushed from the crowd of spectators, holding out a floral yellow towel. Damp and smelled like a woman's body spray, but it beat flashing his junk to a bunch of strangers. Errol wrapped the towel around his waist. Thanks. Limping down from the wreckage of the concrete and mangled van, the obsidian dermis covering Errol's body dried and cracked. The dermis flaked a deep, cold black, revealing Errol's brown skin, chilled gooseflesh from the adrenaline. The immediate danger over, people began to process and the phones came out. Plenty to see. Errol hardly took the headline in the destruction of the foyer. That belonged to a skinny bald man in a pair of overalls, slumped over the bonnet of his van. A van total with rubble of a support pillar and a very Errol-shaped hole. Errol knew he didn't sit highly on anyone's list of friends, but he had not done anything deserving of the lunatic who'd crashed through the glass doors and rammed right into Errol and the concrete pillars. Errol ended up crashing into and through the decorative wall behind the reception desk. The car flipped up on its bonnet. The driver scrabbled out, yelled something about inequality, and then the flame spouted from his hands in impressive gouts. Errol, being rather inclement of being hit by cars, picked himself up out of the rubble and marched right through the flame. It burned most of his clothing, but Errol's dermis was resistant to most mid-range temperatures. Errol summarily cracked heads with the madman. The lunatic was on the bonnet now, dazed, probably concussed. Errol did not feel the least bit sorry. His clothing had really taken to the blaze. It was just torn, melted, ruined fabric now. The lift dinged, and the lobby flooded with more well-to-do in their fancy, non-melted clothing and uncharred shoes. He was supposed to be here for the interview for a security job. The first interview anyone had given him in 8 months. Shit. Errol needed a drink. You must be Mr. Mason. The man who smoked was wearing a navy blue suit. He smelled faintly of new leather and extended a hand for shaking. His nails were neat, manicured, and his palm, when Errol took it, was soft. A man who moisturized. The handshake was limp, gentle. Errol followed the arm up to her face. Smoky green eyes and thin, pale lips schooled into a polite smile. The gentleman's soft blonde hair sweeping in a curly wave over to one side. Clean-shaven, young. He looked like a model for a men's fashion magazine. Hi. Errol prided himself on being quick with words. He wasn't eloquent, but then he didn't wear fancy suits or moisturize. Nice work taking out the trash. It was a bit familiar of the gentleman, the way he said it. I'm sorry, but I don't think we've met. Errol would definitely remember this guy. Nathan Parks, Stardust Global General Chief Executive. There was a lot of title in that introduction. Errol stood up, clutching his towel. This was the guy who'd emailed him for the job interview. Oh, hi, hello. He looked down. Sorry, I'm wearing a towel. I asked for my assistant to find you something to wear. Least I could do, Nathan chuckled. Your resume says you spent a long time working for Miltech. Errol brushed some of the dermis from his hair, feeling about as self-conscious as one might in a situation like this. Yeah, yes. As an armored van escort. And you served in the army during the war? Errol nodded. He didn't like recounting the events of his service during the 2-year war with the alien invasion that had devastated the planet. He had spent 6 months fighting aliens in what had once been Florida. I was on troop transport. So you've been through a few combat experiences? How about de-escalations? This felt like a job interview. There are people on the phone to the police, security guards rushing to stop anyone from leaving the building, and one chubby security guard bravely putting cuffs onto the unconscious, van-driving maniac. It was a hardware van, full of cables and fittings. The logo said, Larry's Home Repairer. We'll drive the hammer home. Errol scratched his chin. An older woman in her 60s came scurrying over with a couple of folded items in her hands. A pair of flip-flops rested on a pile that looked like a spare shirt in someone's discarded sweatpants. Mr. Parks, some gentleman's clothing. She presented a pile to Errol while speaking to her boss. She had a steel gray suit that matched her neatly bunned hair perfectly. Her face was weathered with age, but clean, and she had a minimal makeup over her lips and eyes. Her perfume was faint, something like lilacs, Errol noted. Errol put the shirt on immediately. It was too cold to be shirtless. Is there a toilet? Right over here. The older lady directed him to a side alley that had facilities. He excused himself and went into the bathrooms to change. The sweatpants were too short, but they had a pocket he could slide his wallet into. The shirt strained over Errol's chest, too small and showing a bit too much muscle over a Camp Halito Holiday logo. He brushed more dermis off his arms and turned on the tap to wash soot and dermis off his face. Metagene like Errol made up a whopping 20% of the population these days, mutations in DNA from birth. The upside, a physique that was carved out of muscle. The downside was his metabolism and cosmetic mutations. His sclera were black, the dermis never left his eyes. His nails were black as well. He looked a little like a really buff black goth through most of high school. The cosmetic mutations put people off. The government was in denial about human mutations. Fall into a vat of chemicals and people were fine with the resulting weirdness. But those born with genetic abnormalities? No one wanted to talk about that. Evolution scared folk. Errol splashed water on his face and washed his hands and arms. He still looked dirty and rugged, but at least now he was less obviously covered in plaster and flaking skin. Nathan Parks was waiting in the lobby. Let's have coffee in the conference room. It wasn't a request. Since there was probably a long talk and statement making with the police in his future, the coffee would be lovely. Sure. Please lid on. Part of Errol wanted to slink away before the red tape slithered in, but the place probably had plenty of CCTV footage. Nathan led them to a room past the reception desk. His assistant was already inside, and she had a trolley with morning tea supplies in it. Not just a pot of coffee, but biscuits, fresh cut fruit, cake slices, mini muffins. Please help yourself. Are those ham and cheese sandwiches? Errol closed his mouth before he started drooling. So, with the reading over, let's get to the critique. You might notice that the mouse cursor has changed. If you didn't, I don't blame you because it's a small change. I'm trying to use the cursor this time to indicate what I'm doing instead of the touchscreen. Hopefully that works a little bit better and makes it a little bit clearer. I'll be highlighting as I go along. I have to say, thank God the reading is over, not because this work is bad, but because holy cow, I hate reading. That said though, hopefully I didn't do too terrible a job. It is now pretty much the surface of the sun in this room because Sydney, Australia is under a heat wave. Well, all of Australia is at the moment. And I'm sweating and this room smells of sweat. But that won't stop me because holy cow, my friend did something incredibly brave by submitting this work to me, and I am eternally grateful. That said, I will never go easy on someone when it comes to critiquing. So with that said, and fair warning ahead, I actually don't know how brutal I'll be because this is pretty good. Let's get to the critique. So, as shall become usual, I will be splitting this critique into storycraft and wordcraft. Because this is the starting of a book, or the intro chapter of a book, it'll be a very similar set of criteria as I did last time with my own work. I need to apologize right now because you might notice the audio quality has dropped a little. That's because with this, I will not be pre-recording. I'm actually going live to tape, and which means the audio quality drops a little because I'll be using OBS instead of a professional recording program, only because syncing is annoying. Anyway, so storycraft. Overall, I think this is actually really good. So the idea behind the first chapter, as I discussed last time, is that you need a hook. You want to hook the reader and get them involved in what's going on, i.e. Having opening questions, making them guess and wonder what's going on, want to read forward to find out what happens. In this case, she does a pretty decent job of opening questions, primarily because of this first line. Errol Mason stood stark naked in front of about 20 people. This is a pretty great first line, and it gives you a big question like, what, why? If you open a superhero novel, you don't expect it to open with the main character being naked. Then it goes straight into characterization, which I like. So his cheap suit seems torn, partially melted, unraveled like a tissue paper around one of the exposed building support struts. So it automatically does some characterization and some description in one line. So this second sentence does a lot of heavy lifting. And from there forward, she continues laying hooks. So he establishes a job interview, but also weaving that into more description about him. So he's poor. Why is he poor? That's a question to the reader. Obviously, that's somewhat answered by he's jobless, but why is he jobless? From there forward, it's a little bit of comic relief. So it's intermingling here between characterization, opening with hooks. So you're wondering what kind of job he's interviewing for, why he's so poor, and it's slowly answering why he's naked, and that goes forward here. So it only gets described around, let's see, singed, coal black, revealing blah blah blah. Yeah, there we go. Van totaled rubble in there. Yeah, and then it goes into somewhat of a flashback here. So she does a great job of like having opening questions, pulling you forward with characterization, a little bit of humor. Like I really like he was stealing spoons and sugar packets from fast food stores broke. That's a very descriptive and a nice like one-liner. The other side of that, however, and I will put this forward as a critique, so that side of it's good. She does actually answer a lot of her questions really close to the start, which I find curious. So what you have at the very beginning is Errol's a superhero, he's poor, but then you immediately find out he's jobless. And then he's there for an interview, but you very quickly find out what the interview is all about, or somewhat of a degree what the interview is all about, and who he's here with. You know he's naked, but within a few paragraphs, you find out why he's naked. So if I was to criticize this hook, I would say that there's not enough unanswered questions here. In fact, you even start answering what let's see where it is, a metagene is, like why he has superpowers. It's interesting that she already starts dropping answers here, and I'd probably consider moving that to later on in the book, because no one refers to it as a metagene, so that question hasn't been answered yet. So you're essentially answering questions that haven't even been posed, so potentially losing yourself some opportunity there. But overall, I actually really like the hook of this. And for me, the major part of the hook is the character himself. I like the idea of a destitute superhero kind of idea. I like the idea of this world, which 20% of people are superheroes. It's actually reminiscent of My Hero Academia, which I love. So you always have me there. But in general, like the idea of like a dude who's a total badass, walking through fire, but still jobless and with normal people problems, that's somewhat compelling. I would say there, yeah, like overall criticism is no major deeper hook that's unresolved. Like most of the hooks you lay down here are resolved. All right, moving on. Sense of place and setting. Chicken cup noodles, like it's actually really when something's a modern day piece of work like this one, it's actually pretty awesome to see different people approach setting the setting in different ways. In this case, she goes for the very much a not quite cultural touchstones, but describing things that are very much modern day things, like fast food stores, chicken cup noodles, the paying rent. That's obviously not, well, even though rent's been there for a long time, like people even calling it rent is relatively recent. Old shitty phone puts questions in my mind, like what kind of time period is this? But overall, we're looking at a foyer, phones, chicken cup noodles, sugar packets, fast food stores. You're generally getting a modern day vibe, if not like maybe 90s or 80s. Like it could go all the way back to the 80s. Could be in the future too. The fact that it goes into dropping hints about the World War, which I really like because it was done through dialogue. Let's see where we're at here. De-escalations in combat, army in the war. So this is going back to hooks for a hot second here. This is an example of a really nice hook that is what World War? What is the World War about? Why was it fought? That's a cool hook for the reader, or a question to be posed to the reader. But more importantly, I really liked how it was done through dialogue, and it also sets time and place. So this is definitely not our modern day. From this, it's probably in the future, but again, it could still be, for example, if the war happened in the 70s or 80s, then this could be still like the 90s or early 2000s. You could go either way. There wasn't a particular thing that set it firmly in the modern day, but you also don't really have to, because if you don't do that, what you can do is essentially have this be evergreen within the near future. So until phones are no longer a thing, and fast food joints are no longer a thing, and chicken cup noodles are no longer a thing, then this could be read and understood to be slightly ahead of wherever the reader is right now, which I think is good. Sense of character is the next data point I usually touch on. I think that is fantastic. Yeah, that is the strength of this piece of work. It's interesting. You get a definite sense of what Errol's background is. But again, if I was to criticize, I don't really get a sense of who he is, not really, until he starts dropping like mental one-liners. So, for example, wallet singe, old shitty phone, still working. Let's see, where else was there? That belonged to a skinny bald man. Yeah, there we go. Arrow Hardy took the headline this destruction of the foyer. That belonged to the skinny bald man in a pair of overalls slumped over the bonnet of his van. A van totaled with the rubble of a support pillar and a very Errol-shaped hole. Errol knew that he didn't sit high on anyone's list of friends, but he hadn't done anything deserving of a lunatic who'd crashed through the glass doors and rammed through into Errol in concrete pillars. Like you're getting a little bit of characterization here. The single word responses to the lady does give you something, but like honestly, I didn't really get a good feel for Errol until he started being in this conversation with Mr. Mason. Like Errol needed a drink was one of the first times I smiled. For Errol himself, like situationally there were humorous things, but in terms of Errol actually making me smile with his own personality, that was my first line here. So characterization, I think it's interesting because you get an idea of who he is, but not really what his personality is like until the chapter evolves. In terms of looks, you don't really get a look for him at all. Like you know that he's black, that's definitely true, but you don't really know, is he heavyset, is he tall, is he short? Like I might have missed it, but I don't think so. I don't get a sense of real, like he fought in the war, which gives me a bit of age, but not really a strong age. But also I know this person's writing, that the person who submitted this, and she tends to be pretty light on the main character's description. So that might be intentional that she doesn't do that. Sorry for that little bit of rustling there. So yeah, I would say that characterization is not average, but only a little bit above average. It's not as stellar, because you really get a good sense of a narrator kind of feel. And I did read this in as much of an Errol kind of voice as I could to put it all through a kind of Errol lens when I did my reading. But I didn't really feel planted in Errol's shoes until he started doing things like Errol needed a drink. Whether it's an active scene or not. So next piece of storycraft. Is it an active opening? Sorry, I just have I have notes here. I'm just going to be hitting these one. Yes, it's an active opening to some degree. So if you think about it, he doesn't start in action. He's not really doing anything aside from standing in front of people, and until he gets the towel to put on. Like that, when he says thanks is really the first time he really engages with the audience. Or sorry, not the audience. The audience around him, not the audience who's reading. So he starts acting when he says thanks all the way down here. Until then, this is more of a description of him, or his background and the world around him. It's a weird thing. This isn't active. I wouldn't say. I would not call this an active opening. It's a cold opening in a humorous situation with action in not past tense, in flashback or semi-flashback as it goes onwards. And that is personally, I think, strange, but I think it works because it depends what kind of hook you want to land. This is not opening perfectly like a action hook. Like this is a current time short flashback. If this is an action hook, like a really intense action hook, this would be current time, and you do a proper flashback, not a summary flashback as you do here. A summary, for those who are watching it, is when you're just like essentially, as it sounds, summarizing situations, but what it does is make it much shorter. Like if you tried to play out this fight in real time, like up until where he cracked heads with the madman, then you'd be potentially taking up a page, maybe a page and a half. Because she's doing it in summary, essentially you can do it. Let's see, where does it start? Crashing through a decorative wall and two head body madman. So she's doing it in 2 paragraphs, where it would take like a page and a half. But because it is in summary, this is not the same as a Bond like hot opener where he's actually doing stuff in scene. So I would not call this an active opener. I'd say it's a humorous. It's more of a comedic opener with a somewhat of a action bent to it, leading into a dialogue scene. It's not quite a full active opener. Could this be done better? Well, that's actually totally subjective. I think this works quite well because it is more of a comedic aim for this piece. If you were going for pure action, definitely it could be done better. If you wanted to hook a reader with a strong action hook, this is not that. But if you're aiming for a comedic kind of hook, then this is a pretty good attempt at it. I'll get to a little bit of like improvements you can make when I get to wordcraft. Okay, now last piece in terms of storycraft that I have written here in my notes is showing versus telling. And this is a curious thing with this one. I think that you're doing a lot of telling here, even though you are showing with your telling. So what I mean by that is there's 2 types of telling. There's the type of telling where you just state facts about the past, for example, and there's a type of telling where you state examples from the past in order to essentially show while telling at the same time. And you're doing that here. You're showing while telling at the same time. You're not saying he's poor. Well, you do somewhat say he's poor, but you're not really saying he's poor. He says his breath smell like chicken cup noodles, and the fact that you use chicken cup noodles instead of scotch is showing. Only diet for weeks now, however, is telling. And then you've got he needed a haircut and his shaver had broken halfway down his left cheek, so that's showing and telling. Leaving him with a 3-week shadow on one side. That's just a comedic punchline, but it is showing, I would say. No water in the apartment, clothing smelling of sweat and mold. That is, again, telling while showing. And going commando had seemed like a good idea to reduce the smell. So, the fact that I actually really like this paragraph, but the fact that it's here is something I find curious. Same with he needed this job. He's still like all this, like this whole section here about the past. I would actually consider moving it all. Why? Not because you don't have enough showing in this. Like I think you do a really good job of showing while telling. But the fact is, you start with a bunch of mental imagery and showing. A little bit telling. We called a similar nightmare as a teen. But that's all you really need at the very opening. Because this is, again, the opening of your novel. So I would pretty much have it this much telling at the opening of your novel. Go straight into more showing. So I go straight into your scene. And then maybe come back here just before you do the flashback. Is an example of an edit I would make. Not necessarily you don't have to make that edit. There's probably a better way to edit this information in. But I would, personally, I don't know if you want this much telling so close to the very start. But where it is, I don't hate it either. So, like, if you chose to leave it as is, no judgments there. I think it works. It works because you're going for a comedic open. If you're going for an action open, again, this kind of stuff slows it down. Any telling slows it down. You usually showing, if you're going for a pure action open. But this, again, comes back to what your aim is for this segment. And from your email, which I didn't disclose to the viewer, I know you're aiming for a one-linery kind of comedic kind of bent in an action kind of genre. So you're doing both action and comedy, which means if you're going for the comedy part of it, I have no real complaints there. And this is comedic. I really like this paragraph. Going into overall thoughts before I move on to Wordcraft. I think it's really solid, except for the whole questions to the reading. Sorry, I'm moving the screen a lot. I'm just trying to like get my head around how much goes, because a lot happens in this like first segment, like all the way through to the real interview and getting new clothes. All of it's things are happening. That's what I'll say. But the fact that you don't really have too many questions aside from what is the job ? Is curious to me. It does hinder me to some extent. The fact that you answer so much, especially when it comes to like the what the metahumans, whatever you call them, are. Where is that segment? Navy blue suit. No, it's when he's washing up. Metagene, like Errol. So, especially that metagene stuff, which it wasn't a question we were asking in the first place. Like that stuff is curious. Like I'd probably prefer to be to tell the audience less in this first segment. That would be another major thing. So overall, I think it's definitely above average. I really love like the individual like segments like of characterization and description and background. All those segments work really well. It's just the order that I may have an issue with. But if you left it as is, I don't see many people stopping reading, because it is very engaging as good. Because you are showing up in the middle of a scene. And we discussed this before I did this review, but start late, leave early is kind of the whole deal. So I show up in the middle of a scene if you want to display action, and then leave just before the action starts, so early. That's how you like open a chapter and close a chapter for people at home who don't really get what I'm talking about. So open a chapter in the middle of the action and end just before something is about to happen. That'll make people turn the page. This is that. However, again, because you're not going straight into showing, because you're going to a little bit of a recount, because it's not all active at the very start, I think you might not be entirely executing on that. However, because of the quality of the writing and the humor of it, I think you do okay. So overall, really positive. I really like this opener. As always, there are critiques to be made. No writing is perfect, but I think it's overall very solid. Wordcraft. Now, this is a different bent. We've gone, and this to the audience, you might not know this, but me and the writer of this have gone back and forth on Wordcraft for a while. She's very particular about Wordcraft. I'm more of a, I prefer a flowing kind of wordcraft, and I don't need every sentence to be perfect. But in this case, as the person who's read this out loud, and I know she does not read these out loud very often before she hits send to criticism, read this out was difficult in some spots. This definitely needs a line edit, but I'm pretty sure you haven't done a line edit on this yet, because you have little like I'd have to look it up, but there's parts of this we have repeating words. So usually I don't want to find it, so I'll make up an example instead. Say you have a guardsman. So the guardsman then did this, and then your next sentence is you have the guardsman did that. So usually you'd want it to be the guardsman did this, he did that. So that's an example of using the word guardsman multiple times in a short time frame. In this, I don't want to track it down, but in this, there are a couple of instances where you have doubling up, either within a paragraph or within like 2 sentences of one another. That does make me stumble. But for a large part of it, even things that you'd think would read very smoothly, like his breath smelled like chicken cup noodles, only died for weeks now, with this like a side in the middle here. He needed a haircut and his shaver had broken halfway down his left cheek, semicolon, leaving him with a 3-week shadow on like that. Stuff like that could definitely be broken up into shorter, sharper sentences, in my opinion. And when I read this out loud, I'm not sure if you noticed at home, but I had to cut it quite a bit because I stumbled quite a bit through here. There was that actually is a ongoing, not necessarily issue, but it's an ongoing thing you need to worry about. You need to consider, not worry about, consider. Errol knew that he didn't sit highly on anyone's list of friends, but he hadn't done anything deserving of the lunatic who had crashed through the glass doors and so. About here is when I lose momentum. So, Errol knew that he didn't sit highly on anyone's list of friends, but he hadn't done anything deserving of the lunatic who had crashed through the glass doors and rammed right into Errol and the concrete pillars. So if you read that fast, or if you know what this sentence says before you start the sentence, like I did when I was on my 3rd take, you can read this pretty comfortably. But if you don't know what the rest of the sentence is as you keep going, or you're a slow reader such as myself, then something like this really makes you stumble. So this can be cut down, but that stuff, like I already know the writer of this. She already knows about that kind of stuff, and she'll definitely clean that stuff as she goes along through the editing process. For people in general, this is like a good writing tip, is that don't spend too much time on that level of detail of wordcraft early on in your revision process, because there's points where, for example, if she follows my suggestion and rearranges this whole chapter to be more active at the very beginning and move some of this recount to later on, then she might end up cutting whole segments of sentences, paragraphs, bits of dialogue, all that kind of stuff, or adding bits of dialogue. So you might spend ages editing a sentence like this. Errol didn't sit high on anyone's list of friends, and then cut that sentence. So there's no reason to go deep into that level of line editing early on. But I just want to note, as a general critique for the entire thing, there are some run-on sentences that were actually quite hard. The actual word choice, I think, is quite good. I really like short, sharp dialogue like this. Sure, please lead on. Let's have a coffee in the conference room. Like, I love that kind of stuff. It wasn't a request. This is one of my favorite lines in here, even though it's not cliche, but it's used before. It's not unique. But something like this is a really fun line to drop in there. I'm not sure if you noticed, but as I read this, I kind of defaulted to a more of a detective-y kind of mode when reading it, and I started reading it like a hard-boiled detective. Now, to be fair, I've listened to a lot of hard-boiled detective novels, so falling into that mode is pretty natural for me. But the fact that you made me do that with this writing is good. So, like stuff like this: a man who spoke was wearing a navy blue suit. He smelled faintly of new leather and extended a hand for shaking. His nails were neat, manicured, and his palm, when Errol took it, was soft. A man who moisturized. Like, this is absolutely stellar wordcraft right there. The handshake was limp, gentle, where Errol followed the arm up to her face. Smoky green eyes and thin, pale lips schooled into a polite smile. The gentleman's soft blonde hair sweeping into a curly wave over one side. Clean-shaven, young. He looked like a model from a men's fashion magazine. I love all of this. So, like, yes, when in the minutia, I think your wordcraft is excellent. Sentence structure is the only thing I would potentially work on with some of your longer sentences. Like, he didn't like recounting events of his service during the 2-year war with the alien invasion that devastated the planet. that might have been intentional. Like that specific line, you might have had long intentionally, because essentially what you're doing is you're luring people into a false sense of security with 2-year war, and then giving them a twist with the alien vision that devastated the planet. So that's kind of more like a punchline. So I think stuff like that is fine, but those sentences do run long. So it's one of those considerations you might want to make. Punctuation, no issues. I'm just going through my notes here. No issues with punctuation. I think it was actually quite good throughout. I do have, okay, this is weird and comes down to a matter of choice. Sorry, I'm scrolling a lot because I'm looking for a particular example. Let's see. Okay, yeah. So this is something I found very curious. In a couple of cases, what you have is a person speaking, followed by an action, or preceded by an action in some cases, from the perspective of either the narrator or of Errol. So right over here, the old lady, so instead of right over here, the old lady said, full stop, she directed him to a side alley that had facilities, right? Instead, you have right over here, comma, close quote, the old lady directed him to a side alley that had facilities. So I actually don't know if there's a name for this. I don't feel it's right. I'm not used to it. You might not be wrong though. Like, this is a curious choice, and there's a couple of places where this happens. So you have like a description, not necessarily in perfect, like third person limited, not in perfect third person past tense limited, but you instead have it is a kind of mixed, where it's not quite omniscient, but it's more like it's third person, but everything's from Errol's perspective, instead of sometimes zooming out to the camera's perspective. And I prefer it when it goes out to the camera's perspective. So nice work taking out the trash. It was a bit familiar for the gentleman, the way he said it. So, and then Errol speaks, right? So this is one of those cases where you have a person saying something, a description from Errol's perspective, same paragraph. Then the next paragraph, you have Errol's thinking. And I personally think, and this goes back to why I prefer zooming back out of the camera's perspective, I think this violates stimulus response, like the standard rule of storycraft. Like, this is a stimulus, the person speaking. This is a response, the internal dialogue of the main character. At least if that's what it is. If it's the narrator, that's different. But if it's the character, then I think this is the response to the initial sentence. And then you have a second response. I'm sorry, I don't think we've met. Errol would definitely remember this guy. So you got stimulus, response, response. If this part of the paragraph, was put before I'm sorry, I don't think we've met, then you'd have stimulus, response. You wouldn't have stimulus, response. And little things like that in terms of your structure, I find strange. And I might not be like right. Like I'm not going to say I'm definitively correct on this one. I am no grammar Nazi. But that is how I've interpreted it. Like there's a couple of cases like that where I feel like you're doing a person speaking and action from a perspective followed by or preceded by a perspective, like the same perspective as the description. And I think that breaks the stimulus response. I don't know what you call it. I'd say a fundamental rule. I would group things personally by perspective. So one person speaks, and then interior monologue followed by dialogue, all from Errol's perspective, and that kind of thing. So this shit, Errol needed a drink. So this is Errol speaking. This sounds like a narrator in this perspective. So it's like, shit, he says. Errol needed a drink. The narrator says, you must be Mr. Mason. So in this case, you have, I think, it sounds like you have a narrator. But when you say stuff like this, Errol would definitely remember the guy. Like, you're dipping in and out of a narrator, which I don't know if that's intentional. And the fact that I'm confused about it, it could be just because I'm crazy, but also could be because you might have not necessarily picked up on that, or that might not be working as intended. If it is, good for you, because you definitely have a narrator here somewhere. But if you want to keep it to third person limited, then it would be shit, comma, close quote. or something like that. Comma, close quote, he said he really needed a drink, right? Or shit, full stop, close quote, he really needed a drink. You must be Mr. Mason. So you'd be putting this line behind shit. At the moment, you have 3 people talking. You have shit, Errol said. Errol needed a drink, narrator said. You must be Mr. Mason, Nathan said. So you have 3 people talking. Now, I don't think, personally, I'm not a fan. But if that is the intention, then you nailed it. And with that, active and passive voice, I'm going to be, as I said, I didn't notice any passive voice. I think you've done a call for passive voice from memory from your email. I didn't notice anything. As I said, like, my main issue is the fact that you have a lot of things in recount or telling while showing, to be fair, but still telling in the middle of a action scene. In fact, this scene doesn't really have any form of action until you get to the dialogue exchange between the 2 people. Because of that, you have a lack of activity, but I don't think you actually really have any passive voice. So overall, I think your word craft is pretty good, except for those couple of notes. I don't know how much of that's intentional. So it could very well be that I just picked up on the things you intentionally did, and that if that's the case, great. But my overall opinion of wordcraft, I think, individual in microcosm, I think is absolutely spectacular. Like this paragraph here with the description of Errol's apartment and cup noodles and stuff. Not really apartment, but his life. And this description of the man in the navy blue suit, that was absolutely stellar. Absolutely stellar. But when it comes to things like moving between Errol, a narrator, and a third person, I personally not a fan. So overall, wordcraft a little bit above average, but not stellar. So overall, at least for a first draft, I'd say I essentially have the same landing on both. Storycraft, above average, not stellar. Wordcraft, above average, not stellar. And that is exactly where you want to be, honestly, when it comes to a first-ish draft or a just after alpha reader stuff. Draft. This is a really strong opening. In need of an edit, to be fair, but overall excellent. So thank you for sticking around for that critique. Hopefully I didn't hurt you too bad with that one. I tried to be constructive. And for people at home listening, thank you for listening to Writing Critiques, episode 2, a example of a really good intro chapter to a hero novella or superhero novella. Again, if you want to get your work critiqued, you can submit it to yourwritingcritiques@gmail.com. Like, comment, subscribe. Thank you for watching. See you next time.